Years before, Olivia Hammond and Stephen had built a bright future together. Their shared goals and professional dedication made them a powerful, respected couple. Olivia's relentless drive in finance led to rapid promotions, while Stephen's talent in software design made him highly regarded. Though their demanding careers sometimes created emotional distance, they worked hard to build a family grounded in mutual values, always aiming to stay connected despite their individual ambitions. Over time, Olivia's career success brought her confidence and fulfillment, but sometimes distanced her from Stephen. Her focus on work evolved into a near obsession, subtly pulling her attention away from her husband and children. Outwardly, the family seemed stable, with Stephen ensuring the household ran smoothly and balancing their home life with steady support. Yet, beneath this surface, unresolved tensions and hidden issues began to accumulate, creating the quiet tension of an inevitable clash. One early morning, thin beams of light slipped through the blinds, softly illuminating the room. Olivia turned to look at her husband beside her. Even at 33, Stephen was impressively fit, defying the typical image of someone in tech. Watching him, she smiled. His arm lay draped over his face, shielding him from the morning light like a carefree sleeper able to rest anywhere. She noticed the clock. It was 20 minutes before her alarm. Smiling to herself, she savored the few quiet moments left before the day officially began. She began with a slow, gentle touch, moving Stephen's skin rhythmically over him. His body responded instinctively, his hips rocking in time with her hand. Olivia's smile grew. She enjoyed how easily she could stir him. She knew that her touch was all it took to spark his desire. Stephen groaned softly, calling Olivia an enchantress. She playfully agreed, shifting closer to him. As they came together, he took control, and their connection deepened with intensity. Olivia told her husband she would miss him, turning her back as the hot shower spray warmed her chest and stomach. He suggested that she could always cancel, while he continued to scrub her back with the large loofah. With a sigh, Olivia acknowledged she'd rather be with him and the girls, but explained she was close to sealing a deal she could almost taste. If successful, it would mean another $250,000 bonus, her second of the year, and she mused about the fun they could have with that. Stephen sighed, knowing from experience that there was no point in arguing or questioning their need for more money. He recalled a time when he was the top earner, though Olivia had long since surpassed him. Her ambition went beyond money or negotiation. It was about identifying weaknesses, strategizing, and winning. She was a hunter, always looking ahead to the next challenge. Even before one deal was finalized, her mind was on the next. He assured her he knew she'd succeed, remarking that she had the Midas touch, and everything she handled turned to gold. Olivia laughed, noting that she liked the term and considered it a valuable asset for a banker. In response, Stephen kissed the back of her neck and told her it was his turn, handing her the sudsy loofah. Then he maneuvered to face the shower spray directly, resting his hands on the cool tiles and tilting his face into the warm flow. At the sound of Olivia's heels, Stephen poured a coffee, black with 1 sugar, and slid it to an empty spot on the counter, winking at his giggling 6-year-old daughters. Noticing their laughter, Olivia asked what was so funny, kissing their heads before sitting beside Haley. Hannah giggled, explaining that she was the reason. Haley added that their dad said Olivia couldn't do anything before her coffee. Olivia paused, playfully examining her cup, as if it were something new, which only made the girls laugh more. Smiling, she admitted their dad might be right, joking that she'd better drink up. Otherwise, who'd braid their hair? Daddy? The girls squealed, insisting their dad was terrible at braids, with Haley reminding them how he once forgot their ribbons. Stephen, in mock despair, groaned about the tragedy of the forgotten ribbons, making everyone laugh. Switching to a serious tone, he urged them to get moving. Since Olivia's return to work, Stephen usually got the girls ready, leaving Olivia to do the finishing touches like hair and ribbons. Unless she had an early meeting, Stephen took the girls to school, while Olivia's office lay in the opposite direction. Today, with school on break, he planned to drive Olivia to the airport for her business trip to Melbourne, where she'd join other bankers to negotiate a multi-million-dollar deal. The girls would spend the day at the zoo with Mrs. Foster, who had been with the family since their birth. Though initially resistant to hiring help due to his blue-collar upbringing, Stephen soon saw the benefits. Mrs. Foster's help allowed Olivia to continue her studies, adding an economics degree and an MBA to her accounting credentials. Looking back, Stephen realized his reservations had been unfounded. Olivia was a dedicated mother, and Mrs. Foster was indispensable, managing the household, caring for the girls, and preparing family meals. Haley and Hannah adored her, seeing her as a cherished grandmother figure. While Olivia finished styling the girls' hair, Stephen quickly washed the breakfast dishes, feeling it was wrong to leave them for Mrs. Foster. Hearing the back door open, he smiled. Mrs. Foster's timing was always perfect. After the usual hugs and reminders for his daughters to behave and listen, Stephen grabbed Olivia's overnight bag and headed to the garage. Noting the bag felt heavy, he didn't comment. Olivia would have packed for every contingency. In the dimly lit garage, he put the bag in the trunk and opened the passenger door for Olivia. She settled in, placing her briefcase and handbag by her feet. As the garage door slowly opened, Olivia began chatting. I wonder if that coffee shop on Berkeley Street, the one with the bicycles on the wall, is still there. I don't know. It's been about 7 years. A lot could change, Stephen replied, feeling a twinge at the memory of Melbourne. Oblivious to his shift in mood, Olivia continued, hoping the coffee shop was still there and joking that she might even indulge in one of their amazing muffins. Since the girls were born, Olivia had been strict about carbs, meaning Mrs. Foster had adapted the family meals to meet her low-carb preferences. Stephen forced a small smile. Should I try to smuggle one back for you? I remember you liked the raspberry cream cheese and white chocolate one. Yes, I did, Stephen replied dryly as he navigated through familiar streets. But I think you cured me of that particular craving. Olivia's cheerful glow faded for a moment. Then she brightened, suggesting she'd find him a new treat. It'll be a surprise, she said. I'm sure it will, Stephen replied as they neared an intersection. He slowed down, signaling left toward the city. Just then, a gravelly voice from the back seat startled them. Change of plans, old boy. Turn left. Both reacted on instinct. Olivia screamed, twisting to look behind while Stephen gripped the wheel and hit the brakes, bringing the car to a sharp, jolting stop. Who are you? Olivia shouted, her gaze fixed on the Colt pointed at them. What do you want? Stephen demanded, his hands tightening on the wheel. Their assailant chuckled, savoring their fear. Who I am is your worst nightmare. What I want? That's a bit more complicated, but the real question is why you should do as I say. Why? Stephen asked through clenched teeth. 2 reasons, the man replied, raising the magnum slightly. First, I have a magnum. And second, I have your daughters. Chaos erupted as Olivia screamed and Stephen shouted, struggling to unbuckle himself while reaching for the intruder. Their captor simply leaned back, smiling, and asked dryly if they were finished once Olivia and Stephen finally fell into uneasy silence. Stephen demanded to know how they could be sure he had their daughters, while Olivia, with a defiant tone, asserted that the girls were at the zoo with Mrs. Foster. The man, rubbing his chin and stubble, challenged Olivia, asking if she was certain of that. The rasping sound of his fingers drew her attention to his face, and she noticed with a sinking feeling that, apart from sunglasses, he wasn't concealing his identity. Her stomach twisted, and she wondered if they would make it through the day. As 2 cars pulled up behind them and honked, the man ordered them to start moving and to turn left. When Stephen questioned where they were going, the man growled that he would tell them when he wanted them to know, pressing the tool into Stephen's side to emphasize his point. Stephen complied and followed the instructions. The man then demanded their phones, instructing them to hand them over slowly, without any tricks. He pocketed both phones in his vest, which bulged with unknown items, and then snapped his fingers at Olivia, demanding the other phone. Attempting to appear innocent and confused, Olivia hesitated, but it didn't work. The man insisted, telling her to stop playing games and hand over the second phone in her briefcase. Olivia placed her briefcase on her lap, retrieved the phone, and handed it over her shoulder to him, avoiding Stephen's gaze. Though she felt his eyes shifting between her and the road, his glare burning through her. Stephen's voice, tight with anger, questioned the presence of a second phone, but Olivia replied that it wasn't the time to discuss it. Their captor chuckled, agreeing with her, and telling Stephen that it was indeed not the time to question his wife's secret phone. Stephen glared at the man through the rearview mirror. The man continued, stating that this was the time to follow orders if they wanted to avoid anything unfortunate happening to their daughters. Olivia, with a challenging tone, argued that the girls had gone out for the day and didn't believe the man's claim. She accused him of lying, insisting they left when she and Stephen did. The man snarled in response, lifting his phone to eye level as he glanced between the screen and Olivia's face. After pressing a few buttons, he handed the phone to her. A quick look at the screen confirmed Olivia's worst fears. The man had their unlisted home number. She gasped, struggling for breath as panic rose within her. Mrs. Foster's voice came through, but it was shaky and hesitant. a stark contrast to her usual calm. It sounded as if she was close to tears, and Olivia felt a crushing weight in her chest, like a vice tightening around her. "Hello? Mrs. Foster, it's Olivia. Oh God, I'm so sorry, they've got us. They have the girls. I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop them." Olivia dropped the phone into her lap as if it had burned her, letting out a wail of terror, a raw, piercing sound. Both men flinched. "They do, Stephen. They have the girls," Olivia sobbed, her shoulders shaking. Stephen pounded the steering wheel. "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this? We're not super wealthy or famous. Why? Rich enough, techie. Now hand back the phone, Mrs. "What do you mean? What do you want? Just tell us," Olivia pleaded, passing him the phone. "We'll do anything. Just don't hurt our girls. That's what I like to hear. Now, Stevie boy, take us to the National Australia Bank on Liverpool Street." Olivia and Stephen exchanged a glance. That was their bank. "So, kids, what's the total? How much money do you two have stashed away?" Stephen started to answer, but Olivia spoke first. "About 250K, give or take." Stephen closed his eyes briefly, holding his breath. "Tut, tut, tut, Mrs. Have you forgotten what you just promised? That you'd do anything to save your daughters? Because you just lied to me." In the rearview mirror, Stephen saw the hijacker shake his head, disappointed. "Let's see. What was that amount again? Oh, right. $322,054.75. Does that sound about right?" Olivia and Stephen shared another glance. The amount was exact down to the cent. Olivia nodded. "Yes, that's correct. No more lies, Livy girl, or I might start thinking you don't care about your rugrats." "Please," Olivia begged, wiping her eyes on her jacket sleeve. "Please don't hurt the girls. Do what I say and cut the nonsense. And your girls will be fine." Olivia nodded, more tears slipping down her cheeks. The man frowned at her. "Pull yourself together. You need to make a withdrawal, and we don't want anyone suspecting a thing with you looking all weepy, do we?" Olivia shook her head, fumbling in her handbag for tissues and makeup. Stephen remained silent, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror at their captor. Each time, he quickly looked away when he found the man's gaze on him. From the corner of his eye, he could see Olivia using a small sponge to dab foundation under her eyes. The rest of the drive was tense and mostly silent, their strained breathing mixing with the hum of nearby traffic. Only one person in the car seemed unaffected. As they reached Liverpool Street, Stephen slowed, scanning for a parking space. Nervous, he struggled with a reverse park, prompting a laugh from their captor. Stephen's expression darkened further. For a moment, they stood in silence, focusing on the bank 30 yards across the street. Hearing their captor's door open, Stephen and Olivia followed, stepping onto the sidewalk and awaiting his instructions. He informed Olivia it was time to make a withdrawal, cautioning her against any signals or unusual behavior that might alert the staff. He warned that one misstep would mean she would never see her daughters again. Olivia accepted the briefcase, her eyes welling up as she nodded and acknowledged with a cracked voice. After a brief pause, she repeated her understanding, clearing her throat. Stephen remembered that withdrawals over 50K required 2 signatures and stopped Olivia to mention it. Their captor scrutinized Stephen, gauging him closely, and applied the same warning to him, stating that if he attempted any heroic actions, their daughters would be at risk. Stephen nodded reluctantly, agreeing. Their captor, with a laugh, remarked that 320K was a small price to pay for their daughters. Stephen nodded grimly in agreement. Taking the briefcase from Olivia, Stephen checked for traffic and crossed the road with her, pausing halfway before reaching the bank. He gave their captor a final nod before entering. Inside, they went to a counter. Stephen observed Olivia struggling with the withdrawal slip, her handwriting barely recognizable. Silently, he took the slip, crumpled it, and discarded it, filling out a new one himself and handing her the pen. Her hand was visibly shaking, her expression strained. He whispered for her to take a few deep breaths, reminding her they couldn't afford to make mistakes, and needed to focus on Haley and Hannah, who were depending on them. Olivia nodded, biting her lip as she signed, tears forming in her eyes as she muttered that he was taking everything they had worked so hard for. Stephen simply shrugged, uncertain of how to respond. Olivia then asked why they had been targeted, wondering if his firm was involved in anything sensitive or government-related. Stephen considered. He worked in security and surveillance software, but nothing warranted this. Shaking his head, he asked, "What about you? Have you upset anyone? Closed a bad deal? Passed over someone or triggered any layoffs?" Olivia looked distressed, a few tears slipping down her face as she discreetly brushed them away. She admitted she didn't know for sure, but mentioned that takeovers and mergers often lead to staff cuts, and some in her department resented her recent promotion, as merchant banking was still very much a man's world. Yet, to go so far as this, to take their daughters. She lowered her face into her hands, her shoulders shaking as she struggled to contain her emotions, repeating that she truly didn't know. Stephen observed her closely, realizing she wouldn't pass unnoticed with the bank teller. He advised her to go back to the car, assuring her he'd handle it alone, pointing out that one look at her would raise alarms, and they couldn't risk that. To his surprise, Olivia didn't argue. She gave him a grateful glance, lowered her head, and walked to the door without looking back. Taking a steadying breath, Stephen joined one of the queues. Stephen handed over the briefcase, telling their captor they had done what he wanted, and asking him to let them and their daughters go. Their captor looked around before fixing his gaze on Stephen, remarking that he saw no one there who could dictate terms to him. His expression hardened as he added that they would be done only when he decided, making sure Stephen understood. Stephen pressed his lips together and nodded. Turning to Olivia, the man looked her over with a mocking grin, questioning what had happened to the fearless negotiator and moneymaker he'd expected, suggesting she wasn't as tough under pressure as her reputation implied. Olivia's shoulders slumped, a look Stephen had never seen, even during their worst times in Melbourne. The man sneered further, taunting her, asking how it felt to lose everything she had worked for. Olivia's head shot up, her expression devastated as Stephen wrapped an arm around her protectively. Stephen quietly replied that they hadn't lost everything. Money wasn't all that mattered. They still had each other and their daughters. Their captor mocked him, calling him quite the philosopher, and warned them to keep following orders if they wanted their daughters safe. When Stephen began to argue that they had done as asked, the man interrupted with an imitation of a well-known TV character, saying, "But wait, there's more." Stephen braced himself, sensing there was another demand coming. He asked what more they could do, given that the man had already taken their money. Their captor replied that he needed them to make a delivery. Stephen and Olivia exchanged a look, confused as to why he would go to such lengths for a delivery. The money made sense, but this seemed strange. The man directed Stephen to head to Market Street. Stephen started the car, merging into heavy traffic, convinced they could have walked faster. As they passed Hyde Park, Stephen and Olivia remained blind to its beauty, but the captor noticed. He suggested to Olivia that she spend more time in the park during lunch hours, perhaps by the pool of reflection, reflecting on her life choices. Olivia, half turning in her seat, snapped back, asking what he meant by that. He replied smugly, telling her to stay calm, then hinted that it hadn't taken much to uncover the reason for their move from Melbourne to Sydney, implying she had been involved in something questionable. Stephen winced as Olivia gasped, casting a glance at him as he focused on the road ahead. Olivia defended herself, saying that it had been a long time ago, that Stephen had forgiven her, and that they had worked through it. She asserted that he had no right to bring up their past. The man replied that, on the contrary, his cult gave him all the rights he needed. He added that he wasn't one of her office minions, and noted that her colleagues and subordinates weren't too fond of her, speculating it might be due to her ambition, backstabbing, or demanding nature. Olivia ignored the insults, seeing no point in defending herself. Merchant banking was a brutal, cutthroat world where she'd had to be twice as ruthless as her male colleagues just to be taken seriously. After their time in Melbourne, she'd kept her competitive edge strictly for the workplace. She glanced at Stephen, noticing the pain the man's remarks had stirred. The tension around Stephen's eyes, the tight set of his mouth, and his grip on the wheel all showed the effort he was making to hold back his emotions. Watching his silent suffering, she even forgot their daughters for a moment. Stephen's pain was her own. She hated that her past actions had become a tool for their captor to use against him. Realizing just how deeply Melbourne still affected him, she urged him not to listen, reminding him that the captor was trying to divide them and that Melbourne was long behind them. They were happy, they loved each other, and they had their daughters. The man began clapping mockingly, picking up speed before laughing. "Bravo," he sneered. Furious, Olivia demanded to know why he was doing this, how he knew so much about them, and why he'd gone to such lengths to investigate their lives. She reminded him they were neither famous nor extremely wealthy. The man told her his reasons were his own and warned her to watch her attitude, threatening that one phone call could change everything. Stephen quietly told Olivia to stop and just follow the man's orders, then asked where on Market Street they were headed. The man replied, instructing them to go to 100 Market Street, and asked if they knew who occupied the 5th floor. Stephen admitted he didn't, bracing himself for the significance behind the address. He noticed Olivia had gone pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. In the rearview mirror, Stephen caught their captor smiling smugly back at him. The man turned to Olivia, asking if she knew who was on the 5th floor. Olivia turned to look out the window, refusing to respond, and the man simply chuckled. Stephen turned left and began searching for parking, knowing it wouldn't be easy in the inner city. Luck seemed to favor him, or was it the man's plan, as he found a spot just 100 yards from their destination. They climbed out of the car once more. Olivia looked tense and wary, while Stephen appeared tightly wound, every muscle ready to spring. Their captor handed Stephen a thick, document-sized envelope, its contents unknown but clearly substantial. Olivia stepped back, her gaze fixed on the envelope. Stephen glanced at her, but she avoided his eyes. Unexpectedly, the man handed Stephen a phone, watching them with amusement. He informed them he might have further instructions, warning them against any attempts at heroism and reminding them of their daughters. Then he repeated the directive. 5th floor, number 100. Both nodded and began walking toward the office building, but the man stopped them, telling Olivia she was staying behind while Stephen delivered the package alone. Stephen cast another questioning look at Olivia, but she once again avoided meeting his gaze. As soon as Stephen was out of earshot, the man turned to Olivia. "Can you guess what's in the envelope?" he asked. Olivia nodded, looking miserable. He taunted her further, suggesting she had perhaps become too ambitious or started believing her own lies. She replied dejectedly, admitting that he probably already knew, as everything in the deal depended on it. The man shook his head, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "Insider trading," he remarked, emphasizing the severity. "ASIC doesn't look kindly on people who cheat and break laws," he added, hinting at serious consequences if Stephen delivered that envelope to the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. Olivia's head dropped, her spirit defeated. If the envelope contained what she feared, her career was over, and life as she knew it would change forever. Stephen would be crushed, disappointed, and might not stand by her. She dreaded the thought of explaining herself to her daughters, imagining a bleak future filled with courtrooms and possible prison time. The man offered her a lifeline, saying he'd allow her one phone call to convince Stephen not to deliver the envelope. She looked up, uncertain if he was serious, but hope surged when he extended a phone to her. She seized it hastily, afraid he might withdraw the offer. A quick look confirmed to Olivia that the phone she'd been handed was her burner phone, intentionally chosen by the man, judging by his knowing expression. She felt a brief pang of guilt, but suppressed it. The man told her there was only one rule. She couldn't reveal that he'd allowed her this opportunity. Olivia took a deep breath to steady her shaking hands and dialed Stephen's number. He answered uncertainly. Olivia urged him not to deliver the letter. Stephen replied that he had to, as the man would harm their daughters if he didn't. Olivia pleaded with him to trust her and not deliver it. Stephen questioned why she would risk the girl's safety, reminding her that he couldn't simply disregard the man's orders. She insisted again, asking him to trust her and promising that the man would never know if he tossed it in a trash can. As she spoke, she glanced at the man, who smirked. Stephen, sounding conflicted, asked what was in the envelope that was worth such a risk. Unable to explain, Olivia asked him again to trust her, stressing that it was crucial for both of them. She pleaded with him to throw the envelope away. The man motioned for her to end the call. She made one final plea. "Please, trust me. Don't deliver it." Then she hung up, feeling shaky as she returned the phone, her heart racing. She hoped Stephen would listen, knowing she'd never risk their daughters. The man mocked her, asking if she was familiar with honesty and suggesting she question who the real criminal was, him or herself. The taunt hit close, and she turned away, her cheeks burning. After a moment, Olivia saw him take another phone from his vest, her actual phone, recognizable by a small scuff. He pressed a few buttons, unlocking it with her pin as if he knew everything. "Olivia!" she heard Stephen's voice loudly through the distance. The man replied coldly, "Sorry, it's not the missus, it's your worst nightmare. When you get to the 5th floor, have someone take a photo of you handing over the envelope. Just make it happen." "Okay," Stephen responded, his tone hesitant. Olivia silently pleaded for Stephen to trust her, knowing he'd understand she would never risk the girls. She prayed intensely, more than she ever had, even during their troubles in Melbourne. Every passing minute stretched her nerves taut. What was taking so long? Finally, Stephen approached them, the envelope no longer visible. Had he thrown it away or delivered it? He moved slowly, his gaze down, avoiding eye contact with both her and the captor. Without a word, the man extended his hand for the phone, which Stephen handed over. The man opened it and navigated to the photos folder, leaving Olivia tense and breathless as she sent up one final desperate prayer. The man held out the phone to Olivia. On the screen, Stephen stood beside a smiling brunette who accepted a thick, ochre-colored envelope. Olivia collapsed in despair, feeling as if her world had shattered. Her knees hit the pavement, but she barely noticed the impact. With her face in her hands, she sobbed, asking why Stephen had delivered the envelope, why he hadn't trusted her. Stephen moved toward her, but the man held him back, taunting Olivia about feeling betrayed, saying it wasn't pleasant to have her husband choose him over her. Ignoring the man, Stephen leaned down to help Olivia to her feet, holding her close and soothing her. The man sneered, suggesting that perhaps Stephen's good guy nature was why Olivia didn't respect him, lacking the butcher instinct. Angered, Stephen released Olivia and lunged at the man. They scuffled briefly, throwing punches, while the surrounding pedestrians ignored them and steered clear. The man hissed a reminder about Stephen's daughters, which made Stephen deflate, his energy suddenly gone. Olivia felt his frustration like a cold breeze. The man ordered them back to the car, snapping that they'd drawn enough attention. Once they were seated, Olivia turned and pleaded with him, saying they had done everything he asked, that he had taken their money and destroyed her career, begging him to let them and their daughters go. The man refused, stating they had one more delivery to make. Olivia slumped forward, her mind racing, wondering what more he could possibly do to them. When Stephen asked where to, the man replied, "Chatswood," prompting Stephen to groan. Olivia, now anxious, turned to Stephen and asked if he'd done something illegal, worried about the possibility that their daughters would be left without parents. Stephen looked hurt at the assumption and assured her that while he hadn't done anything illegal, he might have done something stupid. When Olivia asked for details, Stephen admitted it was nothing more than a few careless internal emails about a new client, joking with his colleague Tom about how clueless the client seemed despite his wealth. Relieved, Olivia relaxed, realizing it wasn't as serious as she'd feared. Stephen added, though, that it might be enough to get him fired. The man chuckled, sarcastically commending Stephen's deduction skills and remarking that it would be a shame if his employer decided to let him go. Stephen jerked the car into traffic, cutting off a Toyota and earning a loud honk, which he answered with a rude gesture. Their captor just laughed. Stephen weaved through lanes, accelerating to beat the light before it turned red. Their captor smirked, commenting on their hurry, and Stephen replied that he just wanted it over with. Silence settled, tension filling the car as Stephen and Olivia fell into thought, while their captor watched them closely. Olivia stared out the window, puzzled by the man's motives. Why was he systematically destroying them? Was this revenge for Stephen's remarks about a client? The reasoning seemed extreme. In any case, the why hardly mattered now. By the day's end, their money would be gone, Stephen's job at risk, and her own future uncertain. Worst of all, her thoughts turned to her daughters. She prayed they were safe with Mrs. Foster, as the thought of harm coming to them was unbearable. Stephen, barely holding it together, just wanted to be home with his girls. Whatever consequences came later, he would face them. The nightmare of crossing the harbor bridge passed, and on the familiar North Shore, Stephen parked near the client's office. Turning to the man, he asked who would make the delivery. Their captor, smirking, replied that Stephen might as well handle it, reminding him to follow the usual drill: a photo, no tricks. Handing Stephen a phone and a thinner envelope than the last, he told him to have fun, laughing at his own sarcasm. Olivia glared at him. They watched Stephen walk to the building, his steps purposeful. Olivia turned to their captor, demanding to know why he was so cruel, punishing Stephen and taking their daughters if his issue was with her. He simply replied that all would be revealed, adding with a grin that she needed to put some fun into her workday. When Olivia snapped back, asking if he actually called this fun, he warned her to calm down, reminding her he still had her daughters. Reluctantly, Olivia fell silent, her natural drive to take charge restrained. She felt off balance and helpless, a feeling she despised as failure wasn't in her vocabulary. Olivia watched the street anxiously, waiting for her husband. When Stephen finally rounded the corner, he looked defeated, and her heart sank. She knew he must feel the same helplessness and fear she did. As a loving father and a proud man used to being in control, it must be agony for him to be unable to protect his children. Without a word, Stephen got into the car, handed the phone to their captor, and buckled his seatbelt, hands on the wheel, awaiting the next instruction. Their captor chuckled at the photo, remarking that Stephen could have at least smiled. Stephen held back a retort, and Olivia reached over, squeezing his arm in comfort, receiving a grateful smile in return. The man taunted them, asking if they were curious about the next destination. Stephen replied tersely, saying the man would tell them in his own time, acknowledging that he was in charge. Their captor laughed, suggesting Stephen would make a good officer for following orders, even when he disagreed. Stephen glanced at him sharply in the mirror, and the man casually mentioned knowing about Stephen's military background, noting he'd worked safely behind the scenes, while others handled the risks. Stephen retorted with anger, defending his intelligence work as life-saving and warning the man not to mock him or his fallen friends, vowing he'd tear him apart if he harmed his daughters. The man, unbothered by Stephen's outburst, simply advised him to stay calm and keep following orders to ensure his family's safety. Olivia sensed Stephen's frustration with the response. The man's words hinted that they had more obstacles ahead before he'd release them and their daughters. She clung to the belief that they'd all survive the day. After a moment, their captor suggested they take a drive to the Hawkesbury River, mentioning a B&B with water views. Olivia stiffened, realizing that the whole day had been about her. She struggled to maintain her composure, wondering how he could know about her secret. She'd been so careful. No patterns, no set meetings or meals outside the office. Logan was the only one who knew, her colleague and lover, the one who was supposed to pick her up after Stephen dropped her off. Together, they'd secured 2 massive deals worth billions for the bank. Fury surged through Olivia. Her career was destroyed, her family endangered, and her husband's job at risk, all for a meaningless affair. Logan was nothing more than a brief indulgence after their first big deal, an occasional fling. Neither of them had seen harm in one more celebration after their latest deal. But now, that choice had put her entire life and family in jeopardy. Realizing that the day's events were tied to her indiscretion still didn't clarify who was orchestrating it all. It couldn't be Stephen. He'd suffered as well, and she knew he couldn't bring himself to hurt her. If anything, he'd react as he had after her affair in Melbourne, crushed, withdrawn, and asking what he lacked. And Mrs. Foster's terrified call ruled out any possibility of Stephen's involvement. Could it be Logan? Maybe he wanted to discredit her and eliminate her as competition. He was certainly ambitious and ruthless, but would he risk being implicated himself? Then there was Logan's wife. Coming from old money, she had the resources and connections to pull something like this off. For all Olivia knew, Logan might be facing similar torment. Olivia's frustration grew. Her strategic mind, usually so sharp, couldn't pinpoint who was behind this. Their captor taunted her, asking if she'd figured it out. Stephen turned to her, confused, asking if she knew why this was happening. Olivia wrestled with herself. Her intellect urged her to twist the truth, spin the situation to save herself from a painful confession. But her heart said enough was enough. Her choices had hurt Stephen and put her family at risk. It was time for honesty. "Yes, I do. It's all my fault." Stephen, shocked, asked what she meant. Olivia, filled with remorse, felt a pang of guilt knowing that because of her, they'd lost their money. Stephen's job was in jeopardy, and their daughters were in danger. She'd brought this upon them by breaking the law. She struggled to explain, but their captor interrupted, urging her to get to the point. Stephen sat tensely, his hands on the wheel, waiting. "Stephen, with this latest deal, I bent the law," she admitted. The man corrected her, saying she'd broken it. Olivia sighed, acknowledging she had indeed obtained insider information for the client. The deal hinged on this knowledge. Stephen stared at her, incredulous, confirming, "You broke the law and risked our family for a deal?" She tried to justify it, mentioning the substantial bonus they would have earned. But seeing the disgust in Stephen's eyes, she trailed off, feeling devastated. Their captor rebuked her, remarking that honesty and integrity mean doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Olivia flinched, realizing the irony of a hijacker lecturing her on morality was lost on her in that moment. Then the man pressed her further, his gaze cold, expecting her to reveal everything she'd tried to hide. Head hanging, eyes closed, Olivia spoke in a barely audible voice, explaining that she and Logan Priest led a small, close-knit team for these deals. They worked closely, too closely, she admitted with difficulty, confessing that she and Logan had slept together as a sort of in-house congratulations. At that moment, the car door opened. Olivia looked up, expecting Stephen to leave, but he remained seated, staring at her with a look that bordered on hatred. She recoiled as if struck, realizing that their captor had vanished, leaving only his vest behind. Confused, Olivia looked around, noticing that the briefcase with their savings was gone. She panicked, asking Stephen what had happened, why the man had left, and how they would secure Haley, Hannah, and Mrs. Foster's release. Stephen replied that the man hadn't taken the money. When Olivia, still bewildered, pressed for answers, he turned the tables, asking how it felt to be kept in the dark, confused and powerless, just as she had kept him. She begged him to explain, but he continued with a cold, pointed question about whether she liked feeling left out and afraid. Finally, Stephen revealed he knew everything about Logan Priest, the insider trading, and the fling after their previous deal. He mentioned her so-called Midas touch, sarcastically noting that Logan seemed to have it too. Olivia stared, shocked, a deep blush betraying her guilt. She'd thought she had been careful, but he knew everything and had kept it from her. Overwhelmed, Olivia felt sick, opened the car door, and vomited, trying to collect herself as she realized Stephen's involvement in the day's events. She confronted him, accusing him of orchestrating the torment and putting their daughters in danger. Stephen calmly assured her the girls were fine, safe at home with Mrs. Foster, who had believed she was helping him play a prank that Olivia would appreciate later. Dumbfounded, Olivia whispered, "Oh my God," unable to recognize the man beside her. She accused him of taking all their money, but Stephen moved the vest aside, revealing their phones and instructing her to check the banking app, explaining he had only withdrawn $100. Stunned, Olivia understood it had all been an elaborate setup. She asked who the man was, to which Stephen replied simply, "No one you know." From Stephen's tone, Olivia realized there was no point in asking further about the man's identity. "And the papers you delivered to ASIC?" she asked. "You wanted me to go to jail? You must truly hate me." Stephen shrugged, explaining that the envelope had been full of blank paper. ASIC had received nothing but a stack of emptiness. Relief washed over Olivia, making her weak. "So the delivery to your client was fake too?" Stephen nodded. "Why go to all this trouble?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why do you think?" he replied. "I don't know, Stephen. I don't even know who you are anymore." Stephen gave a slight smile. "Maybe you don't. Congratulations, you wanted me to have a butcher instinct, and now I have it." "Please don't say that," she whispered. "I love you just as you are." Ignoring her words, Stephen asked if she really wanted to know why he'd done this. She nodded, though she sensed the answer would hurt. "I wanted you to experience a fraction of what I've felt for the last 6 months, or since Melbourne, really. If I'd just had an affair or divorced you, you wouldn't have understood the depth of my feelings. I needed you to feel the betrayal, the abandonment, the pain and worthlessness a betrayed spouse feels. You felt it for a day. I've been living with it for months, if not years. Oh, Stephen, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you," she began. He cut her off. "The 2 worst moments of my life involve you. Do you know what that means? I've sent friends into dangerous situations and lost them. But what you did hurt more because it's about the one person who was supposed to love and respect me above all else." "But I never disrespected you," she protested, reaching to touch his arm, which he shook off. "To me, respect isn't hiding an affair or stopping your lover from insulting me. By cheating, you disrespected my feelings, our vows, and the beliefs I trusted you understood, especially after Melbourne." Stephen paused, looking out the window, grappling with the weight of what he wanted to say. He decided to say it all now and move forward, knowing that holding on to bitterness would only harm him. It was like sipping poison and expecting the other person to die. "Being betrayed felt like a living death," he said. "The first casualty was our past. What of it was real, and what was a lie, I'll never truly know. Do you know what the second thing to die was, Olivia?" Olivia, with tears streaming down her face, shook her head. Stephen spoke firmly, saying that their future was the second victim, destroyed by her repeated betrayals and lies. "We don't have a future together anymore, Olivia. You liquidated it." Desperate, Olivia pleaded for another chance, reminding him he'd forgiven her once and promising it would never happen again. She even offered to move if he wanted. Stephen shook his head. "You think this is third time lucky? You vowed to be faithful on our wedding day, and you broke that. 7 years ago, you promised again to be faithful, and you broke it again." He explained that repeated betrayals erode love and respect bit by bit, until all that remains is distrust and resentment. He'd tried hard to forgive her after Melbourne, wanting to see only the woman he'd fallen in love with, but instead he saw her darker, dishonest side. "Funny thing is, I almost managed to forgive until I noticed signs again. At first, I told myself it couldn't be happening, but the doubts grew, and when I checked, my worst fears were confirmed. You were betraying me all over again." Stephen admitted that now he only saw the deceitful side of her, saying the girl he'd married seemed to have vanished. Olivia insisted she was still the same person, apologizing and explaining that she'd gotten caught up in the thrill of winning. She'd felt invincible, saying Logan was just part of the game with no real emotion involved. To her, it was just sport, like a victory lap. Stephen looked at her with pity. "That's where we differ. For you, it's just a physical act. But for me, it's deeply personal, a physical expression of love. Sex isn't just sport, it's intimacy." Olivia acknowledged his perspective, but argued that not everyone sees intimacy and love as intertwined, hinting that part of his hurt might be tied to pride and ego, seeing someone else play with his toys. Enraged, Stephen rejected her suggestion, saying he was hurt because his love ran deeper than simple jealousy. "Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you have a monopoly on emotion. From what I see, you're the one who lacks real feeling." Olivia recoiled, shocked by the depth of Stephen's anger. He had never spoken to her with such venom, not even after Melbourne. For the first time, she felt a hint of fear toward him, the car suddenly feeling claustrophobic. But Stephen wasn't finished. "Well, Olivia, you won't have to worry about hurting my ego anymore. Now you can be with anyone you want, any Tom, Dick, or Harry. I don't care. I want a partner who shares my values, and clearly that's not you. It's time we go our separate ways." Olivia protested, insisting she loved him and believed he still loved her. But Stephen shrugged. "Once I did. I used to love smoking too, but I quit when I realized it was a risk to my health. Staying with you would be just as risky, to my mental and emotional health and my future happiness. Trusting you again would be stupid, and I'm done being stupid." She pleaded, promising to make up for her mistakes and vowing never to risk his love again. Stephen sighed, realizing she still didn't understand. He offered an analogy, asking her to recall the best thing they did with the girls last summer. Olivia guessed it was their trip to Whitewater World, which the girls had talked about for months afterward. "Exactly," Stephen replied. "That's what your affairs are like to you, a thrill. The ordinary things I do can't compare to the excitement of Mr. Three-Piece Suit, the high-powered banker. I'm not exciting or forbidden, just the guy at home. You'll always have those memories, those little escapes from married life. I won't compete with the fantasy," Olivia protested, insisting she wouldn't compare him to those past flings. But Stephen shook his head sadly. "You're in denial, Olivia. Have you never thought of them when I'm out of town or even when you're away?" Unable to answer, Olivia knew he was right. She had remembered and even fantasized about those memories. Stephen continued, knowing her silence confirmed it. "It's bad enough that you think about them when I'm not around. Imagine lying beside you, night after night, wondering if you're dreaming of someone else. You've never felt that kind of soul-crushing doubt." When Olivia tried to speak, Stephen gripped the wheel, lightly banging his head against it. She looked on in alarm, worried he'd finally reached his breaking point. "Enough, Olivia," Stephen said firmly. "Did you learn nothing from today? Every part of it was meant to make you feel deeply. Pain, fear of loss, powerlessness, betrayal, abandonment, anger. I know you felt them. I watched you. Why do you think I orchestrated it?" "I don't know," Olivia whispered. "To punish me?" "No, not punishment. I needed you to feel what I felt over the last 8 months. I never thought I'd feel that way about you again after Melbourne. But I have. You did that to me. Remember today. Maybe next time a man loves you, you'll think twice before betraying him. Please, Stephen, don't give up on us. I need you. I love you. Growing old together is what I want. My time with Logan, it wasn't love, it was just meaningless, like playing a game of squash." "Olivia, you keep missing the point. It might not have meant anything to you, but it meant something to me. Our relationship wasn't just about you. You destroyed my love for you, our life together, for what you call recreational intimacy. That makes me want to rip out your heart, because that's what you did to mine. Want to hear some statistics about lovemaking?" Without waiting for a response, Stephen continued. "The average person spends about 6 months of their life having sex. That's it. Women spend double that time just deciding what to wear. That's what you threw me away for. Something you spend less time on than choosing your shoes." Stephen shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Enough. This is pointless. You don't understand, and maybe you never will." Stephen's words echoed in Olivia's mind. "You don't understand. Maybe you never will." She recalled her own fear, betrayal, and loss today, realizing it was nothing compared to what she had made him feel. She held back tears, seeing how deeply she had wounded the man she loved. Deep down, she'd assumed that if she was ever caught, he'd forgive her as he had before. What arrogance. She realized she had truly disrespected him and driven him to extreme measures to make her understand. Panicked, Olivia tried to express her regret and love, but Stephen held up his hand, stopping her. "Enough," he said again. He checked the rearview mirror, started the engine, signaled, and pulled into traffic. "Do you like making deals, Olivia?" Stephen asked, though he didn't wait for her answer, both knowing it was rhetorical. "Here's the deal. You buy an apartment, I'll buy one. The girls stay in the house with Mrs. Foster. It wouldn't be fair to deprive them of the only home they know just because you couldn't resist rewarding yourself with recreational intimacy." Olivia flinched, realizing how ridiculous her own words sounded coming from him. Stephen continued, either unaware or indifferent to her reaction. "That means you and I will handle the back and forth. 1 week on, 1 week off. No child support or alimony for either of us. We set up a joint account to cover household and child-related expenses. Regardless of personal feelings, we keep things civil. I won't say anything negative about you, and you'll do the same for me. If we're at the same event, we'll be polite." Stephen's calm, matter-of-fact tone unnerved Olivia. She had never seen this side of him before. "And make no mistake, Olivia, there will be no negotiation. It's take it or leave it. If you cause me grief or fight me on this, I'll drop all intentions of shielding the girls from the truth. I'll hand-deliver the real documents to ASIC. Personally, that's exactly what I'd do. I'd enjoy sitting in the courtroom watching the prosecution tear you and lover boy apart. I'd laugh at your sentencing, the longer the better. You're just lucky you gave me 2 wonderful daughters. For them, I'll show restraint. For them, I'll hold back from burying you." Olivia stared out the window, seeing nothing, realizing that she'd had her awakening far too late. She recognized defeat. She'd seen it enough times on the other side of a negotiating table. Her marriage was over. She had lost. Olivia sat in the front of the church, her eyes drawn to the beautiful stained glass windows. Without turning, she knew that Stephen and his wife Lauren were seated at the opposite end of the pew. Lauren. How Olivia loathed her. 10 years younger, with a completely different look. Fair-haired, petite, blue-eyed, and angelic, compared to Olivia's darker, sultry features. But it wasn't her appearance or age that fueled Olivia's dislike. It was that her daughters adored Lauren, that Stephen loved her, and looked at Lauren the way he once looked at her. Now Stephen treated Olivia as if she were invisible, and had done so for over 2 decades. Olivia despised that, even after 22 years, she still missed Stephen. She wished she could hate him for that, but he remained the standard by which she measured all other men. She resented Lauren for embodying everything she wasn't, for the way her daughters raved about her, hugging her often. They should have felt that way about her, their real mother. Instead, they were more formal with her. Hadn't she shown them a woman could have both a career and a family? Set an example as a successful businesswoman? Wasn't she always perfectly groomed and slender, with good taste and culture? Why then was it Lauren they admired and confided in? Yes, Lauren owned a chain of fashion boutiques, and her daughters proudly told her Lauren had worked her way up from the bottom. But did that make her the girls' go-to person? Olivia knew her thoughts were unfair, but she couldn't help it. In her mind, Lauren had taken her place as both wife and mother. Glancing to her right, she noted Mrs. Foster's profile, feeling a slight satisfaction at seeing age catching up with her. Mrs. Foster, too, adored Lauren, a fact that baffled Olivia. She didn't understand why the girls had insisted Mrs. Foster attend. They hadn't needed a nanny in years, but Stephen had insisted she stay on in her cottage after the girls finished high school. The organ music drifted in the background as Olivia tried to let it soothe her sour mood. Her foul temper had started the previous afternoon when she learned that head office had promoted a young woman she'd mentored, someone she felt had outmaneuvered her for a promotion she believed was hers. It was the 3rd time in 5 years she'd been overlooked, and it stung. The priest clearing his throat brought her back to the moment. She wasn't sure why Haley wanted her firstborn son baptized, given they'd never been a church-going family. Olivia suspected it must have been her son-in-law Jasper's influence. Olivia listened with half an ear as the priest continued with the usual ceremonial words. Her attention shifted when she saw Haley turn toward the family and friends gathered. For a brief moment, their eyes met before Haley's gaze moved to her father and Lauren. Then Olivia heard the priest invite Haley's parents to come forward. She placed her purse on the floor and stood, but she frowned as Lauren also rose, walking toward Haley and Jasper with her hand clasped in Stephen's. A light touch on her arm made Olivia glance down. Mrs. Foster whispered gently, "Not you, dear. Haley and Jasper have asked Stephen and Lauren to be Cody's godparents." Embarrassed, Olivia sank back into her seat, feeling stunned as Haley began a speech about why she had chosen her father and Lauren to be godparents. Haley praised her father, saying he had been as close to a perfect father as possible, knowing when to be tough or soft, when to scold or forgive, and always showing her and Hannah they were his priority. She then spoke to Lauren, saying she aspired to be like her, that both she and Hannah often asked themselves, what would Lauren do? Haley thanked Lauren for loving her and Hannah as if they were her own, and expressed how, if anything were to happen to her and Jasper, they couldn't imagine better people to raise Cody. Tears rolled down Olivia's face, not from joy, but from sadness, pain, and anger. She felt betrayed that Haley would give such a speech, knowing her mother was there, humiliated and hurt. Olivia wanted to storm out, but staying seemed the only way to avoid further embarrassment. As she stewed in her resentment, a small voice within grew louder, demanding her attention with each passing moment. You reap what you sow. A flood of past images surged through Olivia's mind, each one a reminder of missed opportunities. Missed birthdays, events, breakfasts, bedtimes, moments when she could have been there for her daughters but had chosen work instead. In the beginning, it had been easier to leave more of their care to Mrs. Foster, avoiding her daughters' sad, questioning eyes and their awkward questions about why she and their father took turns living with them. Guilt made staying away simpler, and immersing herself in her career became a refuge from her shame and responsibility. The more she worked, the more relief she felt. After all, it was easier to kiss a sleeping child than to face a hurt, wakeful one. Later, the distance became routine. Everyone accepted it, and before she knew it, her daughters were off to college. By then, they no longer needed her. The realization struck her deeply. For most of her adult life, she had made the wrong choices, prioritizing avoidance over acceptance, material success over love, career over family. And now, even that career was fading. Olivia leaned back against the hard pew, feeling utterly alone. Haley's speech had made it clear. Olivia wasn't truly her mother in the way that mattered. She was just the egg donor. She could no longer deny the truth. She'd failed in her most important role. Stephen, Lauren, her daughters, and their families had a tight-knit circle of love and support. Olivia had no one. She would never be part of their inner circle, would never know the love they shared. Defeat and loss, she realized, were worse than death. Death offered an escape. Defeat and loss demanded she live with her choices.